Hey everyone! You may notice I'm putting this video out a bit later than some others have. Well, there's a few reasons for that. One is that my copy of the game came about a week later than most other people's due to ordering it from Amazon, who, as you know, refocused their shipments due to current events. And that's completely understandable. They did the right thing, and I somehow survived the extra week. Two, and this is the most important one, is that I decided I would like to take my time with this release after it came out. You know, really stop and think about how I felt instead of just rushing to put out a video to get some clicks with. No, I wanted to do this right and give you all the kind of informative and quality video that you deserve for such a long-awaited title. And this is it, right here, from the bottom of my heart. These are my thoughts on the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's here! It's finally here! After long last, Final Fantasy VII Remake is here, and in our very hands. A living, breathing recreation of Midgar in all its ugly, yet beautiful splendor. I was among the many fans left kind of breathless after seeing the first gameplay videos, and finally trying out the first public demo. I had long since accepted that this would not play the same way as the original, being more action-focused than the classic turn-based style, and had also accepted that we would only be getting a chunk of the original story, with the focus being on expanding the original, in a way where each entry would feel like its own complete separate game. I had even accepted the fact that parts of the story would not be the same. In fact, I was kind of hoping for some things to feel a little different, so long as the core messages and themes of the original story and all of its major plot points remained intact. Now that you know where my expectations fell, we can begin to talk about the game itself. Now, being an action RPG, the gameplay has obviously seen some significant changes over time, though I was also surprised to see just how much was still kept intact in the end. No matter which character you control, square is your basic attack button, and triangle allows for a character's special attack. Circle works as a dodge button, while R1 is used for blocking, which can severely lower the damage you take from some attacks. Hitting X slows down time and allows you to select other kinds of commands, like abilities, magic, and items. This can also be used to cast summon spells or limit breaks once you've reached the criteria for them. On top of your HP, that's hit points, you're also given MP, which is magic points, that are used to cast your spells, so long as you have the required amount. All of these command actions can be performed when your active time battle gauge, that's ATB for short, builds up. How fast it builds up is determined by how much waiting or attacking you do. If you sit back, it'll take longer, while attacking is guaranteed to make it rise faster. It's also possible to pressure an enemy by knocking it back a little, eventually building up to the stagger effect, which knocks it down completely. There are also positive and negative status effects which can raise or lower a character's stats and abilities during a battle. Positives can include increases in speed or defense, while negatives can range from being poisoned all the way to turning into a toad. Can we talk about how cute it is that Cloud still has a little sword after he becomes a toad? Because, wow, I love that. One factor of the gameplay that did surprise me and actually impressed me quite a bit was the game's Materia System. Just like in the original, your weapons and equipment determine the type of empty slots you'll get, which can be filled with various materia orbs you come across throughout the game. These, as you probably know, are used to equip spells and other special abilities, as well as alter your stats a little. As you gain AP in battle, you'll level these materia up, which will give them even more spells and abilities. Leveling up a healing materia, for example, eventually gets you Cura, Regen, and finally, Curaga. Higher level spells, of course, cost more of your character's MP to use, making it essential to keep an eye on your meters. I also loved the way SP was evenly divided every time that you would level up. That way you would never have to worry about giving it to a specific weapon and having to lose out giving it to another one. You could just pick and choose, which was great. Unfortunately, the game can kind of screw you out of MP and ATB usage if your character gets knocked down in the middle of casting a spell or using an ability. That's not to say you can't work around it, of course, but it did prevent me from completing actions on more than one occasion, and depending on the kind of fight you're in, that can be very costly. The engine will likely get compared to both Final Fantasy XV and Kingdom Hearts for its similarities, but I found this one to be very polished and even more engaging in some aspects. I enjoyed using summon spells in this game, for example, much more than Final Fantasy XV. As you gain more party members, it becomes very easy to switch between them on the fly during battle. Perhaps my one issue with this is that whichever party member you're controlling will always become the main target for most, if not all, of the enemies on screen. You quickly learn how to work around this through practice, but it's kind of annoying to see every enemy follow this exact same attack pattern every time. Each character also brings something different to the table, both attack and ability-wise, something I was very relieved to see, as perhaps my biggest issue with the original's gameplay was the fact that all of your characters could essentially do the exact same things, minus your basic attacks and limit breaks, taking away any individuality they could have had. You could tell that a lot of love and care went into making this combat engine, and I'm thrilled that it didn't just amount to press square to beat the game the whole way through. The game also has 3 difficulty options: easy, normal, and a mode called classic, which focuses on the command aspect of the gameplay more, while technically still holding the same difficulty as easy mode otherwise. I kind of wish we could have seen the classic mode implemented on higher difficulties, but it's not too big of a deal. I found normal mode to be challenging in a good way, but never too hard that you couldn't push your way through it. In fact, I never felt any real temptation to lower the difficulty at any point, despite dying a couple of times while trying to figure out certain enemy and boss strategies. That, again, is a very good thing. On top of a chapter select, the game even has a hard mode that you can unlock after beating it once, and clearly lives up to that name. Not being able to use items makes a huge difference and will absolutely stop some players dead in their tracks. I'm no stranger to difficult games, whether we're talking about games by From Software or classic Nintendo-era difficulty, and I still found this to be considerably tough in places. People who still want more replay value will definitely get it here. The game looks graphically beautiful. I'm still amazed at how fast all of this was completed, considering the various change-ups after CyberConnect 2 was let go from the project. Experiencing all of Midgar fully recreated into a living, breathing 3D world is something I can't even describe to you. The only word that really comes to mind here is surreal, and I still don't believe that does it enough justice. The first time I walked into Sector 7 after coming off the train and heard all of the people around me begin to talk with each other about the world, events, or even just life in general, I almost started to cry. It was just that emotional to me. And speaking of talking, the voice acting here is absolutely worthy of praise. Every single character felt convincing and believable to me, but Aerith's voice acting by Brianna White was the real standout.
And who are you?
He's my bodyguard. And a soldier. Pretty cool, huh?
Huh?
We're gonna catch holy hell.
Easy now.
You worry too much. I'm not some princess who needs to be coddled. Shit.
She captured the fun, goofy, and caring sides of the character that I always used to envision in my head as a preteen playing the original Final Fantasy VII for the first time. There's only one voice that didn't grab me quite as much, but I'll save that one for later when we delve into spoilers. The soundtrack is also a pleasant surprise. While parts of it are no doubt a trip down memory lane, there are all kinds of differences in arrangement to fit the moods. If you dislike one arrangement of a song, there's usually at least 1 or 2 more that may suit you better. It's all kinds of varied, and I really enjoyed it all the way through. It hits all of the emotional notes you'd be looking for, and then some. The story itself is a mostly faithful recreation of the original, keeping many of the game's main plot elements intact, while expectedly adding a lot of new elements meant to expand and flesh things out even more. Does it do so successfully? That's debatable, and something else I'll get into later on. Just know for now that I was happy with the majority of it. Outside of the main story content, and despite the overall linearity of the maps and story itself, there are a good amount of side quests you can choose to do throughout the course of the game. These appear in areas like Sector 7 or Wall Market, where you can carry out various tasks for people in the towns and gain rewards like items and experience. While they do add to the overall length of the game, I found a lot of them to be pretty bare bones and a little dull. Go fight some monsters so the area is safe again. Go settle an argument by backtracking to places you've already been. Go find 3 missing children, etc. Don't get me wrong, they weren't all bad, but I found more than 3/4 of them to be nothing but filler missions. And yes, I did all of them in order to come to that conclusion.
Get help.
The next thing I'm going to address is the game's length. By now, everyone knows that this is not, in fact, the complete Final Fantasy VII story, nor is it even close. No, this is the first section of a game which all takes place in the city of Midgar. It typically takes gamers an average of 5 or so hours to complete this portion of the original, while the remake takes just around 35 or so. Just for the sake of reference, it took me a little over 40 to do all of the story and side quests. So as you can see, they obviously added quite a bit in there to make it feel more like a complete game. Does it? Some are going to say no automatically due to the fact that we're only getting a portion of the original story, and that's understandable, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't at least feel like I had a full game experience all the same. How? Well, on top of covering most of the original story beats and adding side quests into the mix, they also heavily expanded on the content that we did see in the original game. This could range from having characters talk for longer periods of time than they used to, all the way to getting entire chapters devoted to an area that used to take us less than 10 minutes to get through. There were times I absolutely loved some of these additions, but others not so much. For example, I really enjoyed Chapter 4 as a whole. It gave us a long and detailed look at both Jessie and her parents, which just made her character all the more interesting to me. I really got a kick out of the new bike segment, outrageous Advent Children style combat and all. I also enjoyed the straight-up goofiness of Roche. I know, he's terrible, yes. But he was one of my first major reminders that Final Fantasy VII used to have quite a lot of silly moments to go with the serious, and in that regard, I think he fit in with the cast here just fine. Other chapters didn't feel quite as special or necessary. For example, right after the segment where Don Corneo drops you through his trapdoor into the sewers, you have 2 more chapters to get through before finally reaching the Sector 7 pillar that your characters keep expressing an urgency that you need to get to in time, before seemingly forgetting multiple times as the chapters go on. As expected, the sewer section of the game was much longer and involved more puzzle solving, which was fine. But then, instead of going straight through the train graveyard like in the original, we only begin there, and actually hit an entirely different location in the middle, a maintenance facility. Here, we have to solve more puzzles mainly involving switches, fight a boss, and then find our way outside, only to get back to the train graveyard and have a whole other map of puzzle solving to do. And then another boss. Now, this isn't to say I disliked the chapter by any means. In fact, it was quite interesting to see Aerith communicating with spirits and trying to help them. But putting a long, additional story in a chapter like this, after being very clear about how the lives of thousands are currently left in the balance, felt very out of place with the overall pacing of the story to me. I honestly had a hard time not looking at this section of the game in a way one would look at a filler story arc in a Japanese anime. And that's a shame, because I actually loved the overall atmosphere of this section, as well as the boss fight with Eligor, who I found to be one of the more challenging fights in the game, alongside Hell House and a few others. Although this didn't happen too many times throughout the game, I still felt like there were multiple moments with needless padding thrown in. Expanding on Leslie's character was great. Having to chase an enemy through the sewers for over 30 minutes because they allegedly pulled the key out of Leslie's hand right as they were about to open a door was not great. Expanding on Hojo's character and overall creepiness was great, but forcing us to trek through lab room after lab room for hours just felt tedious to me. Speaking of Chapter 17, the later parts of it, before the onslaught of boss fights, were also executed in a very different manner from the original, and I don't think I enjoyed it nearly as much. Just to review, in the original, your characters go through a very terrifying scene where the cells they became imprisoned in suddenly open. Cloud and the others see nothing but blood and dead bodies in their wake, while also noticing that the cell holding Genova has been broken into. Were we looking at the blood of the victims or a trail left by Genova itself after breaking out? There was no way for the player to know. They simply had to follow it up to the top floor. The Shinra president had already been killed, with Sephiroth's Masamune lodged into him. The only one around to even make sense of this horror was Palmer, claiming that Sephiroth was in fact alive and did this himself. Between the creepy music and leaving the player to put all of this together in their own heads, this was a truly terrifying moment that made me originally question how this game could even have a T rating. Here, we got something very different. The characters had already escaped containment and were proceeding to reach the top floor. Instead of a blood trail, we see some type of purple goop instead. Some have said that this was done so the developers could make it clear this was a trail left by Genova this time, though I can't confirm. With no dead bodies around, or anyone at all really, the players follow it all the way up to President Shinra's desk where it stops. Instead of being dead already, the president is seen hanging off of a ledge. Barrett and the President have a lengthy discussion, which I actually loved as it felt like a direct response to Barrett wanting to say more back in the original. Just as President Shinra pulls out a gun and believes he's about to turn the tide, he is struck in a similar way to the original, except right before our very eyes. It's after this that the image of Sephiroth we see here turns into, or should I say back into, its Genova form, and a boss fight commences, new to the remake. I'm not going to say that I disliked the entirety of how this scene played out in the remake, but it certainly seemed to remove a lot of the suspense and moments that made it seem so scary to most of us in the first place. Luckily, the rest of the chapter was a lot of fun, particularly the rooftop battle with President Shinra's son Rufus. Thankfully, I can say with complete confidence that I liked more of the additions to this game than not. Wall Market in general was wonderful, and held some of the best parts of the entire game for me. Although I will miss the original methods that Cloud had to use in order to get his dress for Don Corneo's mansion, the addition of new characters like Jules, Madame M, Chocobo Sam, and Andrea Rodea were excellent, and added a whole new dimension of wackiness to the game that I was not expecting. Aerith's confused laughter says it all. The Battle Coliseum provided a great challenge to keep you occupied, and I really got a kick out of the twists done with the squat minigame and new pull-up minigame, which gave me an even greater challenge. Alright, I think we're finally ready to talk about it. What is it, you may ask? Why, the game's ending sequence, and everything that led up to it, of course. From the very second chapter in the game, right after the first Mako reactor bombing, Sephiroth immediately begins to appear and taunt Cloud. This, of course, never happened in the original before, so players already began to realize that something was up. Even stranger was that Cloud seemed to have visions of things that actually happened much later in the game, something else which had never occurred before. Even stranger than that, as the game went along, was the sudden appearance of these ghost-like beings called Whispers, also known as the Arbiters of Fate. As you continue the game, you begin to notice they intervene during specific moments in the game's story. By the time we reached the point where one of them saved Aerith's life, I had them figured out. These beings came out due to things in this story happening differently from the one in the original game, all for the purpose of setting things back to their quote-unquote proper course. In other words, they were there to make sure the game's original story still occurred. So what's making the story change in such a way as to cause these beings to emerge in the first place? Apparently, Sephiroth. As the game went on and he would continue to taunt Cloud, it did occur to me that he must have known exactly what was going to happen here, since he had obviously not been a part of the main story this early on before. It started to make a little sense near the end, as we saw him with a black wing. Do you remember the last time we saw him with a black wing? I'll help you. It was the Advent Children movie, the movie which took place after the end of the original game. Yes, this is the Sephiroth from Advent Children, now coming back in an attempt to change the future and prevent his defeat. Need more proof? Let's take the battle right before the Sephiroth fight, the fight against the Whisper Harbinger. You fight 3 other Whispers called Whisper Rubrum, Whisper Viridi, and Whisper Croceo. At first, I assumed these characters were supposed to be representations of Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett trying to hold on to Destiny's course, but I noticed they were slightly different. If you look closer, you'll see these 3 characters actually represent the 3 remnants of Sephiroth from Advent Children: Kadaj, Loz, and Yazoo. They even fuse into Bahamut. I'm sure there's more connections I could make, but my point is the hints are definitely there. The other point of confusion with the story is the fact that Aerith appears to know of these events to come too. Did Aerith also travel back to the past? Does she relive these events in a Groundhog Day style? Or maybe it's her connection with the planet and life stream that tells her these things? Why are we suddenly seeing visions of Zack from the flashback scene in the original game and the game Crisis Core? And did seeing him not die in this scene signify more changes in the future? As of right now, we do not know. What we do know is this: the course of fate has now been altered. By defeating this Harbinger, the future is now very uncertain. The main characters saw the events of the original game's future, determined it to be the outcome if they were to fail, and defeated fate itself in order to change them, likely all according to Sephiroth's plan. Does that premise excite you?
Careful now. That which lies ahead does not yet exist.
My thoughts on this have been conflicted ever since I finished with my normal mode playthrough. I don't like the fact that all of the main actions in this game are now considered straight up fate, instead of the choices actually made by these characters. Believing that the main characters actually reached the top of the Sector 7 plate-in time, only to be foiled because a bunch of whispers prevented them from stopping Reno, is a hard pill to swallow. Is calling this game a remake even accurate? On one hand, you do play through most of the original story's earliest segments, making it arguable. On the other hand, the plot has gone to such great lengths to distance itself from the original by creating a whole new main narrative, actually changing the entire core dynamic of what this game was originally about. Is it a reimagining? A sequel? It's up to the gamers to decide, I suppose. I can't really say for sure how I felt about the game's ending, since I don't actually know what it's leading up to just yet. What I will say is people playing this for the first time, having never played the original Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core, or even watched Advent Children, will likely be very confused by what they see. And I'm shocked to be saying that. I would have figured that the game would be just as welcoming to new players, but it would appear that's not actually the case at all. Whether you end up enjoying it will likely depend on how much you wanted to see the original story play out here. If you were looking for something new with some Sephiroth action to tide you over until the next game, you may actually be quite happy with this, and I wouldn't blame you, as the original will always exist to us in some form. If not, well, I can also see why you'd be quite upset. I'm personally a little indifferent on it at the moment, at least until I know more. I was definitely irked by the whole thing at first, but now that I've come to accept that this is in fact a very different game with a very different direction, I'm finding it more enjoyable with each subsequent playthrough. I've seen people dismiss the game as bad due to their hate of its ending before. If you were around for Mass Effect 3, for example, then you already know exactly what I'm talking about. But just like in the case of Mass Effect 3, I'm not about to claim I disliked an entire game just because of its questionable ending. On the contrary, I had a blast playing through this. Even with the issues I mentioned above, I never stopped going until the very end, and absolutely loved seeing Midgard cast in this new light. Even with my reservations about the end sequence and the future of the series going forward, I found the game to be more than worthwhile, and an absolute must-play for those who want something the same, but different, but the same, but different.
We can do this. We can. We can change it. Make it right.
So, as you can see, I had a bit of trouble deciding how I really felt about things overall, but still came to the conclusion that it was well worth the trip, even with my gripes. A project like this simply doesn't happen every day, and I'd be a fool not to recommend it to you. If you can accept what the game actually is instead of what it isn't, then I think you'll find this to be a great time, worth checking out as well. Just bear in mind that once the wow factor fades and the nostalgia goggles come off, that you may find a few flaws along the way. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and let me know your thoughts on this remake in the comments below. Hope to see you all again soon when I take a look back at Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus, games that may be more important to this remake than we once believed. Take care, and stay safe.